Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com. Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed.
Welcome, everyone, to the Community IT webinar. This one is Making IT Governance Work for Your Nonprofit. So today we're going to be addressing some questions that seem fairly simple. What IT policies do you need? And what are the best ways to create them? How do you roll them out to staff? And are there barriers that are keeping you from doing this project? And we know that if creating or updating these policies were simple, we wouldn't have to have this panel discussion today with our experts. We would all already have our policies. So if you're feeling paralyzed about starting the project to create or revise your policy, our experts today are going to take questions on where to find nonprofit IT policy templates, how to overcome these barriers and modify the templates to your organizational needs and your strategic goals, and how to get your stakeholders on board and roll out training on new policies to all of your staff. My name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm the Outreach Director for Community IT and the moderator today. And I'm very happy to hear from our guest speakers, Jeff Gibson from Build Consulting and Nura Aboki from Community IT. But first, I'm going to go over our learning objectives today. So by the end of today, we hope you'll be able to discuss essential IT policy documentation for nonprofits and what should be prioritized. Learn how to create or update these IT governance policies, and we're going to share templates. Learn tactics and strategies to roll out policies to all of your staff, and understand barriers to implementing IT governance and how to overcome those barriers. So now I'd like to turn it over to our panel to introduce themselves. Jeff, would you like to go first and also tell us about Build Consulting?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Jeff Gibson. I'm with Build Consulting. I've spent about the last 25 years in the nonprofit and private sector, focusing primarily on analytics and implementing those results into an operational model that's manageable. Trying to take the theory out of things like governance and putting them into practical applications. Build Consulting is a consultancy focused on exclusively with nonprofits, and we are very highly agnostic to vendor or other partnerships. We focus on the strategy and the sort of approach to technology, project leadership, change management. We tend to focus on the situation rather than the technology and what managing change management from an organizational perspective, and then relating it to the technology itself. A large variety of consultants with very diverse subject matter expertise, and we can pretty much find someone that has a deep knowledge base for any problem you might run into. I'm happy to be here, by the way.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here too, Jeff. It's the first time for Jeff on the webinar, but hopefully not the last. Yes, I think we did a webinar with Build a while back, and something struck with me that you often say, which is the technology decisions should be last. That when you're thinking about the problem you're trying to solve, there's a whole bunch of work that comes first before you choose which platform or tool you're going to go with. And I just love that approach. Nura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nuruddin Aboki, Community IT consultant here. I've been at Community IT for about 15 years, helping clients with their IT management strategies, IT planning, budgeting, IT road mapping of their network infrastructure, as well as working on developing IT policies for our nonprofit clients. Over the past 15 years, I've seen quite an evolution in this management of IT infrastructure from on-premises to the cloud. So I'm really excited here to talk about governance, IT governance in general, and how it's been quite interesting watching our clients over the past 15 years.
Yes, I feel like we've said for maybe a couple of years now, that we should do a webinar on governance. Because we always say governance is so important, and those policies are just the bedrock of what you're going to do with IT. But I'm really happy that we're finally doing it. So before we begin, if you're not familiar with Community IT, I'm going to tell you a little bit about us. We are a 100% employee-owned managed services provider. We provide outsourced IT support exclusively to nonprofit organizations, and our mission is to help nonprofits accomplish their missions through the effective use of technology. We are big fans of what well-managed IT can do for your nonprofit. We serve nonprofits across the United States. We've been doing this for over 20 years, and we are technology experts. We're consistently given the MSP 501 recognition for being a top MSP, and that's an honor we received again in 2023. So I want to remind everyone for these presentations, Community IT is vendor agnostic. So we only make recommendations to our clients and only based on their specific business needs. So we never try to get a client into a product because we get an incentive or benefit from that. But we do consider ourselves a best of breed IT provider. So it's our job to know the landscape, what tools are available, reputable, and widely used. And we make recommendations on that basis for our clients based on their business needs, priorities, and budget. And now we would like to go on to our first poll. So the question is, does your organization have an acceptable use policy? And the options to answer are yes, and we know how to use it. Yes, but we don't really use it. Not sure. No, not yet. Or not applicable or other. So we know we have lots of different people on the presentation from different types of nonprofits, large ones, small ones. So do you know if you have this particular policy, the acceptable use policy? And do you also use it? Nora, can you see the answer?
Yes, I can see the responses here. And
Great. Could you read those for us?
yes, about 38% said they have it, but they don't really use it. And about, let's say, 23% said not yet. So there's seems to be organizations that wanting to start. Some are not sure. Then followed by the ones that have it and we know how to use it, which is quite impressive. By 8 people responded to that. And then lastly, there's one person that it's not applicable or other.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for sharing that with us. There's no shame, right? You're in the right place. If you don't have one or you're not sure, that's what this webinar is about. All right. So our first topic, which kind of I think is a great segue into our first topic, is to explain what are the essential IT policy documents nonprofits need to have and why. What are the priorities if you have to start with one before the other? So, Jeff, would you like to weigh in on some of these policies?
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest ones are the obvious ones, the disaster recovery and the data retention. Those are becoming, obvious, but there may be something in particular to your type of organization that you have to prioritize other things. AI is also, depending on the usage internally, could be promoted to the top of that list, depending on what your situation is. Data retention probably is the newest leader in that game because of the lowered cost of lowered point of entry for AI tools and malicious actors. The data repositories tend to make a pretty big target for a malicious actor. But it is particularly your organization, but the obvious ones, I think, are data security and the overall organizational disaster recovery.
Nora, I know we often say that acceptable use policy that we just asked about is one of the bedrock policies that you should have. Can you talk a little bit about what is that for anyone who doesn't know?
Yeah, so it is the foundation of most IT organizations' IT policy. Acceptable use is their foundation policy, a basic policy that governs what staff is allowed to do and not allowed to do with their devices and software. And it usually defines the use of equipment, computing services, and lays out security expectations. Organizations that are thinking of IT policy, thinking that it may be challenging or they don't have resources. One quick one to actually roll out, and there are several templates out there, which I know resources can be shared during this webinar, is that the acceptable use policy is one way to start, because that's the policy that impacts the staff most immediately. If you provide devices to them, then they need to know what to do with those devices, the applications that they use at work. They need to know the applications for productivity, and if there's any room for other applications, or maybe it's quite strict and there's no room to use any other application. So those are, I think that is the one that we call the bedrock, but it's definitely foundational for all organizations. Along that, there is BYOD, or bring your own device. Some organizations allow for staff to bring their own device to work, and having a policy around the use of that BYOD device and applications can go alongside with the acceptable use policy.
I want to move on to the process. So we just published a blog post about a bunch of different types of policies and links to some templates that you can use, including some that are on our site and examples.
That website address is communityit.com/governance.
But once you know that you need an acceptable use policy, for example, or a disaster recovery policy or a data retention policy, what's the process? How do you identify the stakeholders and make them part of the process? Is your policy strategic? Is it tactical? And how do you create an implementation plan? And if you already have a policy, are there different steps that you might take? So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeff. Do you want to talk a little bit about being successful at a process to develop or revise your policies?
Absolutely. One of the things, the easy identification would be any group that holds, uses, or retains data, whether that's end user data, customer data, constituent data. Those folks have to have a meaningful bit of input into how data is stored and accessed, and what sort of what data they need to have access to, and what data can be manipulated. They also need to have, if possible, get buy-in and sign off on your draft policies, especially the data retention policies. It's also critical. One that gets forgotten a lot is data sharing policies. What do different departments share with outside vendors? That frequently gets lost in the shuffle. And really, an organization that does share a fair amount of user data, constituent data for outside vendor analytics or whatever, they really need to craft at least a policy for the vendor to sign once they've been thoroughly vetted. Data destruction, data sharing with their particular partners, et cetera. That one gets missed a lot, but it's critical, because once that data leaves your organization, you have no control over what occurs with it. The one hiccup, and I saw in some of the questions before that came in before the webinar, how to get buy-in. Of course, getting buy-in from leadership is one of the toughest things to do, and getting leadership to prioritize your ever-shrinking timeframes to actually craft these policies. One trick I've used in the past is sort of risk analysis. Putting it into terms that non-technical leadership will understand. Here's GDPR is a great example. The first fine associated with a GDPR violation could be as much as $40,000, and most organizations can't take that hit. And those are by incident fines. So framing it like that, rather than giving a technical explanation, or here's the risk to the organization, here's the financial risk, here's the risk to our continued operations. Those are good ways to get buy-in. And then once you do garner that buy-in, or even if it's partial, always encourage the leadership to be sort of consistent and persistent in their messaging to the larger staff. 3 months into this project, they're going to need that refresher, like, hey, VP X is very into this, and we have to do this for the security organization. So we need you to prioritize this within your own department, your own team, or within your own timeline. It's hard. It's never easy. But, again, framing it in a way that non-technical folks will understand.
That's great advice. Nura, can you talk a little bit more about forming that team? Do you always need to have someone from the executive team as part of the leadership driving the process forward to create the policy or revise it?
Yeah, I think it's important to have executive buy-in and in terms of stakeholders, management team, executive team, and also the board. If you have a board, you could have an governance committee in the board, and that governance committee could have influence to effectively kind of convince the executive team to work on this, making it a priority. So I like Jeff's kind of tactics and approach. We're using the risks analysis to get buy-in, as well as getting stakeholders from across the organization, so you can have a spectrum of perspective. You want your policy to be as holistic as possible. I think taking a few steps back, more and more we are seeing the need arising from cyber liability insurance applications. That if you want to get coverage, you have to have the certain policies in place. More importantly, for nonprofit organizations, some funders require certain IT policies and IT governance policies to be in place. So those are key drivers of convincing executive team to actually create the time to make this a priority.
Thank you so much for that. I want to get into this bullet here that we talked about earlier when we were preparing for this webinar around strategic or tactical policies, and if that impacts who needs to be involved leading the process. So I suppose a more tactical policy might be some of the things you were talking about, Jeff, around the vendor, like you needing to interact with the vendor in a certain way. So having to have a policy around that versus perhaps the acceptable use policy is a more strategic, high level. This is kind of a blanket policy of how we're going to go forward. Jeff, do you have some more ideas on a process when it is a tactical policy need of how to get those stakeholders engaged? And it might be per vendor or per platform. Is that true?
Right. Yeah, I think part of it, I would almost argue that every policy needs to be tactical in some respect, because one thing that does get short shrift is we made this policy, it's beautiful, everybody signed off on it. It was a lot of work, but we're all happy we got it done, and then it becomes shelfware. How do we implement these policies? How are the users who need to execute or escalate on a policy infringement? What do they do next? What are their next steps? How do we, if there was a DR incident, again, I ran operations for the last 20 years, and you'd be surprised that no matter how much we craft the DR policy, the actual execution, that first 3-hour execution, that's critical to the success or failure of your plan. But a lot of folks don't get trained on it, even within IT organizations. So with something like GDPR, you have 72 hours to resolve the issue. If the person in your development department doesn't know anything about GDPR or our process or whatever, that could be a problem. The strategic stuff, that can be prioritized based on the strategic plan of the organization, and you can weight things within your prioritization process for projects, et cetera. But on the tactical front, especially things like COVID, things like changes in legislation, GBLA, or the California Privacy Act, or those have sort of forced a lot of these things to be of greater import. Formerly back burner, relatively safe back burner policy issues are now at the forefront because of right to be forgotten laws across the globe. Turning it into tactical, you have to, with leadership, you have to have that conversation that tactical resources need to be applied to this, and Project X is now suddenly very important because of state, local, federal compliance issues, or a new compliance issue related to our industry or our space. Therefore, explaining to leadership not only here's why we have to have buy-in, here are the urgent issues, but then also what's not going to be done. And managing those expectations that there are, again, every organization I've ever been in, especially on the nonprofit space, is just taxed for time and resources. So, there's a finite amount of work in the week if you want to keep your staff. So, strategically measuring tactical problems is more of an art than a science, but there are some tools to help you do that.
Thank you. I want to get back to this question also of some places may already have a policy, but it's really outdated. Maybe they haven't updated it since people were working remotely, or since everything was in the cloud, or since the advent of AI. Is it easier, Nura, to update an existing policy, or do you recommend that they just start over, start from scratch? What's better?
Well, I think a review of the existing policy might be easier, given that they have somewhere to start from. But IT policies these days, there are several templates out there. So even if you don't have one, you can reach out to partners, vendors, to get samples of templates that you can work with. But if you have an existing policy, you will need to determine whether changes have occurred in your organization. This is where the assessment comes into play. Like if you have an assessment done, you may notice the transformation in technology has happened, and where your outdated policies need to change. So it needs to be rewarded, for instance, to cover the new technologies that you're currently using, or even some regulatory requirements that have come about, given the changes that the world has gone through, or your environment has gone through, or your organization needs. Then there's that also question about this. As you're updating this IT policy, you really want to also focus on the communication. How are you going to make sure you maintain the communication or communicate the changes to the policies to all your employees, and then provide necessary training to them. And then periodically, you need to have a way to regularly check for any compliance with the policy, and maybe addressing any issues or violations that may come about.
That's right. Like one of the reasons you have a policy is so if an employee does something that's against what the policy says, that you have some standing there. A really great question just came in from Mary Elizabeth, who says, how do you create IT policies that allow for flexibility as IT continues to rapidly evolve, especially as Gen Z is joining the workforce? And I have a quick little anecdote on that, where I was at a conference and a bunch of people my age were sitting around saying, oh, we don't need an AI policy because we've just told people they can't use it. And I said, are you never going to hire anyone ever again? Because I guarantee every 20-year-old coming into work at your organization will be using AI for practically everything. So do you have advice, Nura or Jeff, on making policies that can be flexible? Is it just a matter of revising them often enough?
I think it is. I think it simply comes down to that. It's not very clever, but literally putting time on a yearly or bi-yearly basis, or quarterly, depending on how rampant change is in your organization. But AI, something like AI is the perfect example. If you have a timed quarterly or biannually review of certain documents, that's the best way to just block off that time. I'm talking at a very logistical level here, but with the hustle and bustle of every day and ever shifting priorities, knowing that there's a time where these 5 stakeholders get together and say, has anything changed since our last meeting, and documenting those changes. And, Nura talked about it a little bit earlier, having a section at the tail end. I started life as a tech writer, having a section at the tail end of a document with significant changes, version controls, revisions in the document, just to sort of archive those changes. And then also making sure that maybe new groups need to be involved. If you have a new department that's utilizing something like AI, And then the other thing from the IT leadership perspective is you have to have an awareness, and it's sort of schizophrenic, but you have to have an awareness of everything new going on, and imagining ways in which departments you don't oversee could potentially be sort of backdooring things like AI tools and into the environment. And also not just your policies, but updating your trainings as well, and maybe calling new training. Just that's not, if you're in a schedule of yearly, IT training that gives everybody 15 minutes and they have to take a CBT or something, that's one thing. But specialized focused training on emerging trends or changes to the workspace that you exist in, that you have to have that in your tool bag, and don't be afraid to have a sort of training specifically associated with a significant change in the workplace.
That makes sense. I think that's another way to kind of get people's attention. If there's something new and exciting like AI, you can invite them to a meeting about it and then work in the policy as well. Here's what our rules are going to be, and here's how you can help contribute, et cetera. So I'm going to move on to our next poll, which is communication style. So I will read the options for you. So you could have an organization communication style that's top down, that you like to have rules to follow. You might be a more entrepreneurial or collaborative organization, like herding all the cats. It might be small team based, where you need consensus, or just your culture. Consensus is very important for you. Everybody is on the same page. It could be only you at your nonprofit. So in that case, your communication style is to yourself. Other communication styles, there's a whole bunch of other ones. I just chose some of the bigger ones. You can put that in the comments if you have a different type, or not applicable again. And I want to just say there's no judgment. Styles are styles. No one of these styles is better than the other or more effective. I think the most important thing about knowing your communication style at your organization is self-awareness. Knowing the communication style helps you communicate in ways that are effective. So following your regular process, if you're a top-down liking to have rules, then you don't want to throw that out of whack with having a collaboration and having everybody come together and put their say in. That'll really be difficult. Jeff, would you mind reading the results of the poll?
Top-down, 21%. Entrepreneurial, 35%, small team based, 33%. There is only me at my nonprofit, 2%, and 8% for other, and 2% for non-applicable.
Great. And we had someone did put in the chat their different styles. So a fractal messaging process, updating the higher level folks so they understand and can support their direct reports. And then we update all of the staff. That's an interesting strategy. We're moving from entrepreneurial and small team to more top down. Good luck with the change management. That can be tricky. Of course, we like rules, but herding cats is how we operate. I hear you. I see you. And we're in a period of growth and looking at policies across the board. That's very clever to do that, for sure. And a combination. Yeah, I think with most people, there's a combination. And sometimes it depends on the person, right?
In part 2 of the podcast next week, the experts are going to talk a little bit more about implementation and rollout and how that's different for existing staff and new staff, and how to collaborate with other teams at your nonprofit to do the rollout and the training on the new policies. They're also going to talk more about the barriers to creating or revising the policy and being able to effectively roll it out. So please join us next week for podcast part 2. You can also view the video and read the transcript on our website, communityit.com.
Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed. Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.